A very, very warm welcome to all participants and our speakers. We have a very, very good speaker with us today, Mr. Nandakumar. A lot of you know him, and a very, very interesting topic which Mr. Nandakumar is going to brief us on the unshackling of agriculture. Both the pros and cons is what he will discuss. We also have the committee head of our policy research, Dr. Sachidan Shukla, and the co-chair, Indranil Pan, with us today, who would, Dr. Shukla would take the question answer session with Mr. Nandakumar. So before I hand over to to Dr. Shukla for a brief introduction, let me just take half a minute to talk about the chamber. As a lot of you would know, the chamber is the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry is a 184-year-old chamber set way back in 1836. Over the years, the chamber has developed, looked at various aspects of the corporate world. How does it help? How do we look at the policy research? How do we look at any and every single act which comes in from the state government or the central government, from various PSUs, various institutions, break it down for our members, take the feedback back from our members to these institutions and the government bodies to ensure that there's a smooth relationship between the corporates as well as the legislature. And we have got various other wings as well, which look at generally as to how the corporate world would develop. Agriculture is a very, very integral part of our not only economy, but of the Bombay Chamber as well. And towards this, we are very happy that Mr. Nandakumar, who is a retired IAS officer and an expert in this field, is with us today. Thank you, Mr. Nandakumar, for sparing time. I'll just take half a minute to talk about Mr. Nandakumar. He had joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1972. His work experience of 44 years includes urban development, commerce and industry, international trade, textile and natural fiber, food, agriculture and cooperation, and disaster management. He's worked as chairman with the Spice Board Cochin for 5 years. He joined Secretary Textiles in charge of policy in the early 1990s and 2002. Food Secretary, Government of India from 2006 to 8, and Agriculture Secretary from 2008 to 10. He was a member of the National Disaster Management Board from 2010 to 2014, Chairman National Dairy Development Board 2014 to 16, concurrently Chairman Mother Dairy Fruits and Vegetables Indian Technologies Limited, IDMC Limited, and the Institute of Rural Management. Senior Research Fellow at ICR IEMR, worked with INSEAD for 3 years and served as a member on various other boards, supply chain. He also served as chairman working group on disaster management for his 12th five-year plan. He writes regularly for national and international journals and publications. I could go on and on, but Mr. Nandakumar requested that I keep it short. This is as short as I could. So thank you once again, Mr. Nandakumar, for being with us today. I hand this over now to Dr. Shukla for a brief introduction on the topic. Dr. Shukla.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you on behalf of the Economic Policy Research and Development Committee of the Bombay Chamber for joining in today. And I hope all of you are staying safe along with your near and dear ones. In Mr. Nandakumar, our panelist for today, we have someone who has been there and done that. You would have heard from the brief introduction that he's actually hemmed quite a few of these positions which we are going to be talking about. For example, not only was he the food secretary, but also the agriculture secretary, and he's also been chairman National Dairy Development Board, Mother Dairy, and also the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, IRMA, as we know it. Welcome, Mr. Nandakumar. We are delighted to have you with us today. I'll just take a minute to set the context and give a backdrop first and request you to share your initial thoughts thereafter. And then we'll have some questions from my side before we open up for Q&A from the participants. As we all know, it has been an unprecedented year. I mean, nobody really thought that 2020 is going to be turning out like this. In fact, we had quite a few of these rosy reports from the consultants, uh, just like every single decade, that this is going to be a huge decade in terms of growth and prosperity and development. But the coronavirus shock is one of the worst we have seen in over 100 years easily. And growth, you would have seen, is cratered everywhere. Lives and livelihoods have been shattered almost every corner of the world. And this is the most democratized sort of disaster or pandemic that we have seen ever in the world. And even as we speak, countries like France and Germany, etc., and some others in Europe are getting roiled by the second wave. And yet, you'll be surprised to know that agriculture in India remains an island of hope in a sea of doom, right? You would have seen the first quarter GDP contracted by almost 24%, but agriculture was the only one sector in the economy that recorded positive growth. As you know, for the year as a whole, FY21, growth is going to be close to minus 10%. I'm just using a broad average of most forecasters. But only agriculture is likely to grow in the positive territory. Most people expect it to grow at, say, 3%. And as you know, agriculture remains vital for our economy, not only because it has a lot of people who really have their livelihoods based on agriculture, but also the allied activities. When I look at the monsoon, it was bountiful this year, and we are in for a record food grain output this year. The Kharif output touched a record of close to 145 million tons, and the government has done a lot in terms of scaling up the procurement operations through FCI procurement agencies. It has bought a record, whatever tonnage of wheat, etc. Water tables, as you know, have been replenished, which bodes well for the Rabi crop. MSPs were announced in time. And I think this is an important statistic. The central government's total spending during April, August, the numbers that we have, went up just 6% in the economy, right? But if you look at spending on agriculture and rural development, it went up 78% to about 1.8 trillion rupees, almost 2 lakh crore during this period. And very importantly, the center state coordination has been commendable. And that has kept the wheels of agriculture and rural sector moving. And therefore, I think this has cushioned large part of the economy from this once in a century kind of a disaster. We are able to breathe easy. There are a lot of structural issues. We know why agriculture is important. Land is fragmented. 86% of farmers are marginal, and 47% of the total land is owned by marginal and small farmers, right? So I think these are some of the well-known, say, issues with agriculture, and yet, like I just spoke about, in the near term, it has really done well. What has happened and why we have Mr. Nandakumar today with us is that the Parliament has passed three bills. These are now acts. The Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Ordinance, this was passed. The Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services, and the Essential Commodities Act. And all of these essentially aim to increase opportunities for farmers and their welfare. Let me now, with this backdrop, request Mr. Nandakumar to share his take on these acts and also what lies ahead with us. So over to you, Mr. Nandakumar. Thank you once again.
Thank you. I have a small PowerPoint presentation. In fact, I was quite hesitant because most people see it on telephones or iPads, and it's not easy to read these. What I have done is, based on Dr. Shukla's request, tailored this presentation to something of interest for people in the business of agriculture, which could include the input side or in the business of agriculture on the post-output side, which is right up to the food that we eat. A lot has been written about these three acts. A lot has been spoken. It is still being spoken of. There are contradictory views. There are positions that people have taken, starting from the constitutional propriety to states' responsibilities, etc. I'm not getting into any of those. I think there may be some clarifications which I'll give you a little later. The simple thing is that these are now the law of the land. It's been ascended to by the president. There is nothing else to show that there is something to the contrary which is legally valid on the table. Now, to make it very simple, there are three laws that we are talking about. One is an amendment. The other two are new legislations which have been passed, initially issued as ordinances, subsequently enacted as laws for the country. And I have sort of put them in order of priority from a business perspective. I would think the Essential Commodities Act is probably the most important, followed by the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Act. I call it for convenience as the Mandi Bypass Act. This is exactly what it does. And the third one is, again, a long name, but let's call it the Contract Farming Act for convenience. Can we move to the next one, please? Yeah. Now, to me, the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act is a very important amendment. Those of you will recall that the Essential Commodities Act passed in 1955 actually took its origin from the Second World War shortage. So that's the kind of vintage we are talking about. And this act is essentially something that we handle shortages with. And it has been used in a very ad hoc manner. And normally it has been used in favor of the consumers. Whether it has actually benefited the consumers itself is a question which I think we'll have to answer at some point of time. But the use of this act in various capacities and on various occasions, and on the number of occasions it has been used even in 1 year. In fact, there are people who have done these numbers which go to anywhere between about 12 to 13 times in a span of 2 to 3 years in certain periods of time. Whether it has helped anyone is a matter of debate, but it has definitely affected both businesses and the farmers' income. I mean, that's no doubt. Now, what does this new amendment say? It brings in a certain amount of predictability. Now, when I say predictability, one is it brings predictability to 6 items, basically foodstuffs, edible oil seeds, oils, and this is largely the kind of things that we are talking about. Then what they're saying is that earlier the state government or the central government could introduce a stock limit on the kind of quantum that people can hold, whether it's wholesaler or a retailer. Now they have said that no, you can't do it every time. It has to be either of the 4 conditions that are written there, which is war, famine, natural calamity of a grave nature. I don't have a problem with those 3. The problem is, what is extraordinary price rise? Now, extraordinary price rise is subject to interpretation. And this is something that I know was discussed while this was being drafted. So they said, okay, we'll put 2 triggers. The trigger for perishables will be 100% increase over an average price of the last 12 months or a 5-year average, whichever is lower, which at least is something that you can see, because otherwise somebody would say, okay, it has gone up by 5 rupees, that is extraordinary. Somebody will say it's gone up by 10 rupees, it is extraordinary. Now, extraordinary can be very extraordinary. So one is, therefore, it is predictable. The triggers are predictable, and on non-perishables like rice, wheat, dal, etc., it will be a 50%. So there are 2 indices which you can calculate. I think it's probably in the public domain, and you can look at where the prices are going up, and then only a stock limit will come. Even if that comes, 3 categories of people are exempt, and this is extremely important. And this category is not wholesalers and retailers. It means that processors, value chain participants, and exporters are exempt from even these stock limits. So even stock limits are imposed. A processor of raw materials, like somebody who makes bread or biscuits or atta even, or a value chain participant who can sort of convert the whole pulse into a dal and sell it at retail, or an exporter. All these three are exempt subject to their installed capacity, or I don't know what exactly the words demand for export in the law means, because that can be interpreted differently. But I suppose it's export commitment that the exporter may have. I think that's the way I would interpret it. So essentially what it means is, let's say you are a person who is buying wheat and making atta and selling in the market. You can buy your entire year's demand depending on your capacity, and keep it for sales for the next 12 months without fear of any stock limit coming. So essentially, if you are a processor, whatever that process, or you may be an edible oil manufacturer, you can buy your mustard or soya bean or whatever and keep it without fear of an ad hoc stock limit falling on your head, and continue processing and selling. So in my view, this is probably the biggest change which will help you plan your business a year ahead. Otherwise, what used to happen was that you had bought everything, and after 2 months, somebody says prices have gone up, and suddenly you are sitting on 100,000 tons of wheat, and suddenly they say, no, you can hold only 25,000. You don't know what to do with the 75,000. You have to offload it in a certain period of time, which means you either take a loss or you do something else. Now, all that, in my view, has been removed. Well, this is, I mean, many people would argue that this is not adequate, but I suppose it's a great beginning. I'm sure that people who are in the business of food processing would find great virtue in this amendment. And if you're saying or looking at the next 10 years, the food market becoming more of processed food in some form or the other, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I would also think that post-COVID, there is clearly a preference for people to buy what I would call safe food. And safe means traceable, packed in good condition, displayed in good condition, sold out of a decent, clean shop. I think, therefore, there also, this whole idea of a value chain participant becomes extremely important. Can I go to the next one, please? Yeah, now the Mandi Bypass Act basically bypasses the Mandi. And now the APMCs were not only institutions which created problems in terms of higher fees and cess, etc. But my own reading was that they also compromised quite a bit on quality, because a lot of stuff will come there, get mixed up. I remember when I was doing cotton in the early late 90s, pure white cotton will come to the mandi in Hyderabad, outside of Hyderabad, and it will become yellow in no time. Now, whatever tax you pay is of no value, because basically the mandi yards were fairly unclean. And secondly, I don't think you get what is called a fair average quality, which means an admixture of various types. The law amended says that you can trade anywhere outside the mandi premises. They have defined something called a trade area. And anybody with a PAN number, the farmer producer organizations, cooperatives, any of them can buy. You can buy either from a farmer or from a trader, and no APMC fee is to be paid, and no license required, because license used to be one of the biggest problems in operating in the APMC. I know that even something like NAFED had a problem in getting a license from the Azadpur Mandi in Delhi, in spite of some of us intervening. I mean, that used to be the kind of coterie that was working there. The only conditions there is that you have to make the payments the same day, and in any case, not less than 3 working days. And if you're not paying the same day, you need to issue a receipt, which I suppose shouldn't be a problem. There is a dispute resolution mechanism in the case of non-payment or underpayment or something, which is to be resolved by a board which is appointed by the local subdivisional officer with some kind of an appeal to the district magistrate. And there are some fines for violation of provisions. Now, this also allows you to introduce an electronic trading platform, which is, sorry, which is a very important thing for people. You can now, I think, look at introducing an electronic trading platform and get into the e-commerce mode, if at all you think there is enough value in that. Can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, this is the Contract Farming Act. Now, there has been contract farming in this country. There has been, I think, 2 examples of contract farming which are very successful. Are the one is the seed industry, the other is the poultry industry. You can get into different types of agreements. One is you can just say, okay, produce me so much quantity of this quality and I'll buy it at an agreed price. Or you can say, okay, I'll give you the inputs, I'll provide you the farm services, and I'll pay you for the labor or the management that you do. You can have combinations with another third party or a multiple type of an agreement. You can also have a fixed contract in terms of price. You can also have an indexed contract. You can say, okay, I'll give you 2% more than MSP if you give me less brokens, higher quality or whatever. Or you can say, okay, this particular thing without pesticides, I'll give you 10% more than the market price, whichever way you want to index it. You can also put in your quality and standards, which is extremely important if you are a processor. And you can have a third party to verify both the quality, the quantity, and the standards. And this, in my view, is going to be the most important part of your business plan. Because if the dairy industry succeeded, if Amul is big, it's primarily because the farmers trust their verification of quality and quantity, both in terms of fat or SNF or whatever. You can also have a third-party aggregation so that you don't directly, the company doesn't have to directly do this. You can sort of use a third party, including an FPO, to do the aggregation for you. And you can bring in other elements like an insurance, credit, extension services, whatever. I mean, this whole package is possible inside this. And in the contract itself, you provide for a conciliation board. The board will do the conciliation. If they fail, of course, there is the local SDM and the DM to resolve that dispute. Of course, the only thing here is that the penalties for sponsors, that means people who contract with the farmers, are very heavy. And the penalty on the farmer side is very, very low. In fact, it is restricted to whatever you have given him, whatever cost he has incurred. So, I mean, you have incurred on his behalf. So therefore, there is a little bit of bias in favor of the farmer, which I think is important. Otherwise, he may not want to come into a contract farming agreement. Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, now I'll just touch upon what I think are the business opportunities. Of course, it's quite large. As I said before, processing both food, feed, and fiber, I think the whole thing will come there. Will become a good proposition to go into, because you will not be hit by most of the limits. That is important. You can also go and buy outside the mandi. When I say outside the mandi, you can buy at farm gate, you can buy at a warehouse, you can buy at a cold store, you can buy anywhere. So you can create your buying options outside the mandi, and you can sort of look at the quality that you're buying. In terms of exporters, there will be a predictability in terms of what you can own in stock. You can have the business plan, but, and I say this with a big but, the Foreign Trade Development and Regulation Act 1992, and incidentally, those of you who were around in the Commerce Ministry in 91, 92, or who were doing business would remember that there was this imposing office called the Controller of Imports and Exports, who could sort of tell you today morning that you can import and tomorrow morning you cannot import, kind of a thing. And part of the 91 reforms, I think this was one of the things that, it's more about developing exports than about controlling imports. That's the national agenda. And this entire DGFT, the CCI&D became DGFT under this act. But unfortunately, our onion exports have been banned under the same act. So whatever be the intention, when it actually comes to a decision, you can have a problem there. So as long as this act is there, the ad hoc bans, etc., on exports per se can come without too much notice. The other business opportunity is to set up electronic trading platforms, because eNAM has not really been a very big success story in terms of getting value to the farmers. So those of you who have a specific interest in a particular commodity could look at setting up electronic trading platforms in the country wherever you feel it convenient. One thing that we miss in this whole discussion and debate on the legal side is the announcement of a large number of funds for agri-infra, dairy and livestock infra, and also fisheries. And when I say fisheries, it includes inland fisheries, it includes cold chains, it includes even retail. Now, what happens in many of these, as I see it, is at the retail end, our cold chain, suddenly stops. It gets carried into something and then it goes out into wherever. So a lot of these products which would really need a cold chain infrastructure like a freezer or something at the retail point, it doesn't happen. So I think that's an important one. So as I said earlier, the quality chain, organized APMC fees, etc., is the kind of exemptions that you get. So you get these enabling provisions. Can we go to the next one, please? Okay, contract farming, you can go outside the Indian Contract Act. The Indian Contract Act is quite a complex legal document, and you can get into the new act and organize people whichever way you want. And as I said earlier, you can have a product delivery mode, you can have an input product services paying charges mode, you can have a tripartite agreement, you can bring in new technology in production. Of course, whenever I say new technology in agriculture, immediately I'm asked, will it permit genetically modified seeds? I think that's only one of the technologies. And instead of raising it, I think we can look at many other things that we can do. You can bring in much better post-harvest handling, because then you are in charge of the produce. You can buy it at the farm gate. You can tell him how to harvest, when to harvest, how do you transport it to your processing centers, etc. And you can also look at niche markets, which can be organic, pesticide-free, and in the case of poultry, antibiotics-free or whatever. And the most important part, if you have bought through a Contract Farming Act, you are exempt from the stock limits under the EC Act. So again, the people who will invest long-term in businesses with farmers, I think, are the ones who are being encouraged under these amendments. So what in a, can I go to the next one, please? Yeah. So in a nutshell, let me put it this way: processors, value addition players, exporters, even input providers, including insurance credit, technology providers, and infrastructure players should look at new opportunities which are being opened up. Now, what are the challenges? These legal things open up policy space, but other conditions like technology, infrastructure will still be a challenge till we see it. Probably it will take 2-3 years before something happens. And we have to look at sustainability in the long term, because I think this is not a short term kind of a thing. And most importantly, the farmers will not come and enter into any of these unless they see a certain value in the new ecosystem. So if they see a better price or a better input or a better extension mechanism, or even a better hand-holding in terms of whatever the problems are, I'm sure they would be willing to work. And this is precisely a model business which should be market-driven and not the usual let us produce and look at where to sell. I think it's the other way around. It will be probably from fork to farm rather than farm to fork. And of course, the business plans, I think we have to look at long-term sustainable profitability. I think that's where I would think the opportunities are. Of course, I mean, this is probably a very short summary, because I didn't want to make it too long and too complicated. So thank you. I'll take the questions from Dr. Shukla after this, or whichever way, Dr. Shukla.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Nandakumar. I think you put everything in the right context. You've given us a great backdrop, and this is an excellent summary of some of the things. Um, so let me probably begin with the first of my questions. If these reforms, and a lot of people have called these reforms game changing, right? And I guess these days we are using the term game changing very loosely. But if they are indeed game changing, why are farmers opposed to the new laws? And also, what are the key fears in your opinion? And are they justified in your opinion, if at all?
I think this has to do with more with the kind of promises that have been made, and governments have not been able to deliver. I mean, like we kept on saying, double your income. They really took it to heart, and they find incomes have not really gone up. Then they are also aware of the Shantakumar Committee report, which talks about reducing procurement under MSP and shifting to a cash mode. So I think there is this fear that MSP may be diluted, if not done away with, and that could sort of create a problem in many states. And I think primarily the problem comes from Punjab and Haryana, where there are two issues which are sort of intertwined. One is that Punjab, in terms of paddy, they sell off their entire thing in about 45 days. And I think 13 odd millions of paddy is procured in a space of about 45 days. So they want to sow the wheat immediately thereafter. So they bring the entire thing from the harvest to the mandi, and they sell it off. Now, if there is no MSP, I don't think the private sector can actually step up and buy this quantity, even if they pay a higher price. So there are these kind of issues that they're afraid of. The second is the government is losing their market fee, which is about 6% gross to two fees put together. And the Ardiyas are losing 2.5% commission. So there is again a commonality of interest in terms of loss of revenue to the government and loss of revenue to some private players. So this fear, obviously, in that environment, everybody is afraid I am losing something out of this. So that is one. But let me also tell you that in terms of value of output in agriculture, this entire MSP of 23 crops add up to only about 25-26%. So that is something that very often we miss in the narrative. So this is this is probably the fear. I think if there was no Shantakumari Committee, probably the fear would not have been there. And this is unfortunately the Modi government's one of the first reports. So,
right. So, Mr. Nandakumar, just for the benefit of some of the people here who may not really be well versed with this, why did we have the APMCs in the first place, and why did they fail, right? Because this is something that keeps coming back as a question. And also, more importantly, I think what happens to the mandi infrastructure, price discovery, and payment process without the APMCs? So, I mean, if there are none of these, or they're diminished in stature, what happens to price discovery and payment processes, etc.? Like you mentioned, they had some role in the system over the years, over the decades.
The APMCs were the first set of solutions for price discovery. I think early 60s, they're kind of first ones are, I think, late 60s, the markets were set up. So about 40 years, they've survived in many states. Now, what happened was these were set up as price discovery agencies with representation from farmers, from representation traders, government, etc., as a kind of democratic institutions. But over a period of time, I think the traders took over in some form or the other. I think the people inside those mandis started having the upper hand, and they started dictating terms. And the government found that there is some revenue to be had out of this. So, they kept on increasing the market fee from 1% to 2% to 3%. And they found that this money is useful for putting into rural development. And in fact, if you look at Punjab, many of the village roads came out of the APMC fund. So they did their job at some point of time. But then, again, the revenue loss that the government see in many ways. And the farmers are also comfortable going into good APMCs, wherever the APMCs are developed. Like Punjab, they would probably not go anywhere because the infrastructure is there and there is provision for drying, storage, whatever. So that is, well, in a way, they failed because I think like all good institutions fail at some point because Western interests take over. I think that's a short answer. I think we will have to see that both the price discovery mechanism and the infrastructure are maintained, because without that, we might have a problem on the other side. Then the farmers will find that they have nothing to refer their price to, because typically what he will do is he will go to the mandi or find out from the mandi what is the price going, and if you're offering him even 5 rupees more at his farm gate, he will sell it off. But if he has to take the entire goods to the mandi and then find that he is not getting the price that he is expecting, he has no choice. He just sells it at a price by the evening. He can't take it back to his house. So there are sets of problems. Now, has Bihar, which has abolished the APMCs, done better? The answer is no. Has Kerala, which never had APMCs, done better? The answer is again no. So I suppose APMCs, we need to keep them in a much better, and I would argue that they should become farmer-owned kind of institutions, and they should restrict their development to the market premises that they have. Then they can really create world-class infrastructure there. I mean, don't waste your money on roads and all, because now there is enough money in the government budget to do rural roads and rural electricity and all that. So I don't think we should throw the baby with the bathwater. We need to keep it.
Right, interesting. I see two disturbing developments. Looking at newspapers and some of the media reports. So the first one is, I think the more things change, the more they remain the same. I mean, just look at the price controls and trade restrictions that have been brought back for onions, right? How will things change when they remain as arbitrary as earlier? I know you mentioned in your presentation the fact that the government has put out some parameters where people can monitor, but end of the day, it still looks arbitrary. That is one. The second disturbing thing that I see is some of the states have come up with bills. I mean, Punjab, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, uh, and they have tried to override these laws, and they've come across, they've come out with their own versions of laws, which of course requires the presidential assent to become a bill. How do you see these two developments, one at the center and the other at the state level? How will this impact the efficacy of these so-called game-changing reforms?
Yeah, that is why I disagreed with my friend Ashok Gulati, and I wrote that it's not a 1991 moment, it's only a 19 moment. So it's a halfway kind of a thing, because as long as you have the foreign trade regulation kind of an act, you can put minimum export prices, export restrictions, export duties, all that you can do. And I think as long as the consumer is going to make noise, and that noise is politically very sensitive, this ad hocism will continue to some level. And I hope over a period of time these prices will get published, and there will be a little more of predictability in the ad hoc decisions that they make. And the three categories that I mentioned, I think if they are exempt clearly and they are not touched, even in the current order of the onions, they've only said wholesalers and retailers. They have not said anybody who dehydrates onions. So I look for these little small print to understand what they're doing. So I suppose that is one little light in the tunnel. So that's one. On the state governments, I suspect it's more political than anything else. 254(2) is a very complex part of the constitution, and my hunch is the president may not give any assent to that. You can have this great debate on whether entry 33 is state or center, etc. In fact, entry 33 was done in 1954 to enable the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. So you should have objected then. I suspect that that was missed. My own hunch is this may not have too much impact. And in Punjab, they've done a very clever thing. Even though there are 23 commodities on which MSP is announced, they have defined the minimum support price as minimum support price for rice and wheat only, or paddy and wheat only. That means cotton, maize, everything else, they're not really bothered about. So I think even in these state amendments, I think they're being very practical or clever, if you want to say so. So there will still be a lot of space that will be left. In fact, I think today you can go and buy cotton in Punjab without any problem. So if that's what you're really looking at, I don't think you are covered by even the Punjab amendment. So let's see what Rajasthan does. They might also do the same thing, one or two crops of which, they have interest in.
Right.
So I would think that yes, it's not a perfect kind of a place to work, but what it has happened is, what has actually been done is some paths have been opened, and you have to look at those paths very carefully. I mean, it's not a big national highway; it's probably rural roads. A couple of them have opened into the business space.
Right. Thank you for bringing in these little nuances. Very helpful. The next question that I have is, so contract farming has been permitted in India for quite some time now,
Yeah.
like you mentioned in one of your slides, but has not been really as successful as one would have wanted. Now, how is the new contract farming law different from what has been practiced or permitted earlier? And what do you think it will do to boost contract farming or this activity now?
Well, this is different in the sense that this has a much quicker dispute resolution mechanism. But my take on contract farming, after having worked with different types of farmers, is I don't think anybody, neither the business nor the farmers, interested in a dispute or a resolution of that dispute. I think this works on trust. Now, the poultry industry has been able to do well in a contract farming mode. It's because I think the farmers had trust in the companies that looked after them. The seed companies have done very well, even though, in the case of seed, the payments are fairly late because the seed companies collect the seeds from farmers' fields and they do a genetic purity testing because it's a seed. And that takes time, and the payments are done much later. But they have succeeded. I think many parts of Andhra Pradesh, you will find that seed companies have done well. So I suppose it's more about bringing in technology, more about holding their hands, more about producing niche products than a conventional thing. Okay, let's go and do a contract farming on wheat. I don't think that should be the kind of thing I would look at. I would probably look at, okay, let's go and do long staple cotton fiber, which I need for my value addition, or a high oil content mustard so that I can get more oil into my processing. I mean, something of that sort. And then say, okay, I don't want pesticides in this, so please don't use pesticides. I'll give you an extension guy who will look after your pest management problems. I think this is going to be a very selective niche kind of a movement. It'll take time. It'll take a long time. And even the farmers will be initially very reluctant to do this. So I think this needs a lot of convincing, a lot of background work.
Right. So if you were to tell us about the opportunities, the say 2-3 big opportunities for the corporate sector or the formal sector, from whatever the government has done so far, what would these be? And I think you alluded to the dairy sector and the poultry sector. Are there any lessons from there, the white revolution, etc., for us, given the current context and these reforms?
Yeah, I let's look at my take on what's going to be the market for food in 10 years. It's going to be clearly less of cereals. Of course, when I say less of cereals, I'm saying less of cereals on your plate. I mean, the maize will go as feed. So even though you might consider it a cereal, I think when we look at the demand projection, we look at poultry feed requirement as the major factor. There will be more fruits and vegetables and protein on your plate. Even I think except the lowest quintile, I think the rest of it, the NSSO data is showing that all of them are moving to a slightly higher intake of proteins and other things compared to cereals. And that's also important from our own nutrition map that we have. The hunger map that we have is nothing we should be proud of. I think we are behind Bangladesh, we're behind many other countries. So how are we going to address some of these issues? And the urban market is going to be more about a little more of healthy food, a little more of wellness food, and clearly safe food. I think this is how I would see the market moving. And if you're going to sort of serve that market, you need to have some control over production. It could be pesticides, it could be post-harvest handling. I don't think you can go and buy stuff in a mandi, sort it out in your godown and create good value products. So I think somewhere that is where I see one big movement for the food related companies. The second are the input guys, people who are into fertilizers, pesticides. That's very large. Very often when we talk about agri GDP, we don't count the fertilizer guys or the pesticide guys. Now, how are they going to handle these contract farms, or a big buyer who is a food company is going to put in a certain amount of conditionalities into production? How are we going to sort of re-engineer your products to ensure that the farmers are able to do that? So that's, in my view, the second part. The last part, of course, is this huge infrastructure that is likely to come. And with the kind of interest subvention and everything that is coming, who wouldn't want to invest in infrastructure? Because if you're going to move food in a hygienic and in a cold chain, I mean, outside the cold chain or inside the cold chain in a hygienic manner from farm to the retail shelf, a lot of investment is required. So that would be the other one. And riding on this overall will be a lot of credit and insurance companies, because I think insurance is going to catch up, because farmers are probably not, even if you have a contract farming, I'm sure you will say take an insurance, because if you don't have a production, I am not going to lose my money. So I think insurance will be driven largely by these contracts. So I would see this broadly as my
right.
Yeah.
So I have one more question on your vision of how Indian agriculture would look by 2030, and what role would these laws, etc., really play over the next decade. But I think I see quite a few questions on from the participants. So what I'll request you is maybe we can come back to my question towards the end. Let me take up some of the questions from the participants. One is from Dr. Sudhir Kumar Goel. What he is asking is, how could innumerable agri verticals be horizontally integrated in value chains connecting farmers to consumers, and by whom as a business, not as a charity?
Sudhir is a very knowledgeable person. I think he should answer that himself. He has worked with me. No, I think, well, it's a very complex kind of a question. I would think that, one connect that I see somewhere in the near future is a connect between FPOs and the market, and a connect between farmer producer organization and agtech companies. The agtech companies cover space from soil and moisture management to food. I mean, in fact, Big Basket and Grofers are classified as agtech companies. So they are at one end of the spectrum, and there is Cropin and others at the other end. I suppose this has to evolve, but I'm not very sure that without sufficient handholding and a serious interest by business, large business concerns, this connect will happen. It cannot happen through because there is no equivalent of an NDDB elsewhere. Let's face the fact, and we don't have a Dr. Kurian any longer. So it's not just the institution, you also need somebody who will drive it. The government has announced 10,000 FPOs. I was reading the circular. It's a delight for a bureaucrat, but I think no farmer is going to take it. So, I think we have to create institutions which will serve. One option is probably a federation of these guys. But I would think that when businesses from the market end, and that's what I said, from folk to farm, if that movement happens, probably some of it will get resolved, some of it will remain open. And I'm sure Sudhir will have a difference of opinion. He can sort of, we can talk to him later on that. Or if he wants to come in now, fair enough, up to you.
So great to have you, Dr. Goyal, with us today. Is there a follow-up question, or else I'll move on to the other one? Maybe we can connect with him separately as well. A couple of questions. I don't have the names here, but somebody's asking how the reforms will help small farmers. And there is one more question I'll just add to this, saying, as an entrepreneur, whose door should I knock on in order to have precise guidance and knowledge to start some of these ventures or run these ventures in the agri sector?
Well, it depends on which venture you're talking about. If you are going to be an aggregator, which is a space which is there available to you, because I am sure that large multinational corporations are not going to open offices to buy aloo or buy vegetables or buy tomatoes or something. I think they're going to use a large number of aggregators. And how do you then become a good aggregator? It need not always be a farmer producer organization. That is one level where you can look at connecting with the market. That is one. The second is you go down and connect to the farmer, which is one area where there is a huge space, because if there is one weakness in the Indian agriculture system, it is the weakness of extension. In fact, our entire extension machinery is geared to rice and wheat. The moment you introduce a new crop, I don't think there is enough knowledge to advise the farmers, and we are going to grow in the other direction. We are going to have more fruits, vegetables, dairy. In fact, I always ask this question: who vaccinates poultry? How many vaccinators do we need? I mean, in COVID, we talk about vaccines and vaccinations and all. Who vaccinates poultry? How do we create vaccinators for poultry? If egg and chicken are going to be a big take on the market, so I think, the answer is that you probably need to make up your own mind depending on where you live and where you want to start work. And then look at what options do you have. And look at a business model which is something that you can actually roll out. Advice, I don't know where the advice will come from. There are a lot of people who are in this business. There are now even private agtech people, like somebody like a Samunati Foundation would probably have a lot to tell you. There are many others in the field who are doing this, and there is this Think Ag group, which Ram Kaundinya and company have formed. I think they also have a lot of activities on connecting people to businesses and to success. I mean, that you have to sort of search out yourself.
Right. Somebody's asking, APMCs are basically reliant on taxes and fees that they collect. So a decline in mandi volumes because you're allowing people to sell outside the APMCs will only hurt mandi infrastructure. I think you alluded to this, but what he essentially wants to ask is, would APMCs eventually then die out?
It may not. It may not die out. It will reduce in its scope and size. But I would strongly say that they have to reinvent themselves. The high time that they looked at their own weakness. They have a lot of strengths, and they should build on their strengths. Now, if the farmer thinks that, yes, going to the mandi is beneficial for me in terms of the facilities that I get, in terms of the price discovery I get, in terms of the credit or fertilizer or input kind of facilities I can access, or even knowledge that I can access. In fact, I would think APMC should become farmer-owned organizations. I think that's where, and they should not spend money hereafter on roads and streetlights and things like that. They should make these mandis, world-class infrastructure with cold stores, automatic weighing machines and stuff like that. So then even businesses would go there because you'll get much cleaner stuff. Nobody minds paying 1% if you get a service.
Right. So I have two questions on contract farming, one from Mr. Rahul Agrawal, the other from Karuna Nawalkar. Essentially, they're asking, that Contract Farming Act permits buyers to enter into an agreement with farmers prior to any production, right? If there are any sharp deviations in the post-harvest prices, um, and given that there could be farmer protests with local state political support, because if this is a politically sensitive subject, corporates therefore may be wary of proceeding with contract farming agreements. And the intended impact of this bill may not be realized. This is his apprehension. The second question that Karuna Navalkar is asking is, having low penalties for farmers, then they're not much bothered and they can renege anytime. So I think these are related questions. Maybe you want to answer as one.
One is this fear is expressed very often by people who want to enter into contract farming, and it's partly true. It's, in fact, the failure happens on both sides. When prices fall, the companies back out. When prices rise, the farmers back out. There's a continuous kind of a problem. But one of the things that is that I had realized while I was pushing this was that, you have to engage the farmer through the year. You buy one crop of his and leave the second crop to his market intelligence or whatever, then he's not very comfortable with you. So if you can give him a cropping plan for a whole year, I think one is it averages out somewhere. The second is you can always say, okay, whatever is the APMC price, I'll give you 1% more, or I'll give you exactly what is the APMC price on that day. So there are ways in which I think you can work around this, but it's a long-term buildup of trust. And I personally think this will not take off in a very significant manner, except in some small pockets. And once people start having this, for instance, if you're doing organic, what do you compare with? You can't compare with the run-of-the-mill mandi price. So you have to have a predetermined higher price and say, okay, you don't use any, or you say pesticide free, much simpler. And if you're going to put that in the shelf saying that it has no pesticide, I'm sure you're getting a premium. So why shouldn't you pay a premium to the farmer? I think you have to work these business models out. This only is a very enabling kind of a platform. How you innovate on that platform is, I think, your business acumen.
Right. Mr. Ujjwal Kumar essentially is asking, the new generation's taste has changed substantially. I think you alluded to that just, I think, a couple of minutes back, saying the preference might move away from cereals into proteins, etc. And which he's saying may lead to demand that can be narrow as far as crop varieties are concerned. And we know that it is healthy to eat millets, etc., but there may be no demand and therefore crops will slowly fade away. How do we deal with such a situation where some of these things, his fear is we are getting into a largely westernized kind of taste in foods and things like that, the urban demand especially?
Well, I'm not very sure whether that assumption will be very correct, because my own reading is that people are, even in West, I think people are trying to do different things right now. So it will be a largely fragmented kind of it's not the same thing that, it's not the same bread that will sell. People will want brown bread, multigrain bread, bread without ragi, bread with ragi, no gluten. This is how the market is probably, look at the types of milk that we are selling. 1% fat, 0.5% fat,
Absolutely.
3% fat, 6%. I can't sell a 1% fat milk anywhere in Punjab. There's no way I can do that. I have to have 6% fat there. So I think what is happening is the market is getting into segments. And this is where the contract farming thing will work. Now, if Karnataka, people living in Bangalore are going to feel that ragi is a good thing for them. And in fact, ragi is one crop which sells above MSP. I think it has been selling in the last 10 years above MSP. So, when you say millets, which millet, how is it amenable to your taste? Because nobody will eat it because it's good. It is also to taste good. So how do you sort of combine this? Now, fresh and frozen may be another one which may see a big revival. Instead of the tela on the street, you might want to buy it from one of the stores which has a proper cold storage, sorted and put into packets, etc. So what I'm saying is that yes, at one level there is a problem in a meso planning for the whole country, but I think the business opportunity really is where you look for which market you're selling to and then what do you sell. Otherwise, why should happy cow's milk sell higher? And in fact, when we introduced cow's milk, it started selling at a premium other than the mixed milk.
Right.
There's nothing that you can actually distinguish between the two in terms of if you dilute the fat there, it's the same thing. But this brand value of cow's milk.
Right.
So I suppose that's how you create these markets.
So I'm also looking at the watch. I'm still getting a lot of questions from people. In the interest of timeliness, what I'll do is we can get some of these questions and have it sent to you if you're okay.
Sure,
Answering.
sure.
A couple of them are on logistics. Some people trying to ask what is the future of agriculture and how can reforms help small farmers, etc. And then one question is also on DBT. But in the interest of timeliness, I think we'll probably need to close over here. So thank you, Mr. Nandakumar. It's been fantastic. You've given us a great overview of the opportunities and some of the challenges. And with your experience, I mean, the rich experience that you have on the policy side, you gave us some of those nuances, which I think some people may have overlooked. I mean, some of the legislative things that you pointed out to. So thank you so much once again for speaking with us today. I'll just hand it back to Indraneel for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Sachidanand. In fact, I have been privileged enough to propose the vote of thanks today. Indeed, it has been a thought-provoking session, as even Dr. Sachidanand sort of just pointed out. On behalf of the Bombay Chamber, I sincerely thank you, Dr. Shri Nandakumarji, former Secretary Agriculture GOI, for sharing his thoughts on the vibrant issues of the agricultural reforms and Agricultural Bill 2020. Thank you again, sir, for the insightful address to our members, which was quite widely sort of attended. The importance of the developments of the agricultural marketing front are possibly significant. Some of those have been highlighted by you. Signaling a repeal of the archaic laws that have come to throttle some of the efficiency gains that this sector could have provided us with. India has reason to be self-sufficient in food production, but these have barely translated into any tangible benefits for the farmers. The value addition chain, namely the warehousing, processing, corporatization, have also failed to effectively take off in India, except in a few pockets. The presentation clearly lays out the perspectives of the recent reforms and gains that are likely for the farmers and to the business community who would want to engage themselves in the agricultural sector, thereby providing a positive feedback loop to the farmer community. Understood that the gains cannot be immediate and could have also politics involved in it, especially evident by the farmer uprisings in some states of India recently. But the recent changes will bring in predictability to the policy, an element much needed to foster business opportunities. Importantly, too, the farmers could also benefit in terms of their own disposable incomes due to better pricing of their produce, as they remain free to take their produce anywhere they want beyond the APMCs. I sincerely also thank Harinagar Sugar Mills and Nishem Solutions, our key sponsors for the event today, for supporting us in hosting the virtual conference. We do hope to continue working with you and receive your consistent support to ensure an impetus to economic growth and reforms, as well as making Mumbai an international hub for business and financial services. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Sandeep Khosla, Director General of the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industries, for taking time out of his schedule to deliver the welcome address. Dr. Shukla, I also thank you for your comments and help in guiding the proceedings of the day. I would also like to thank the board members, invitees, and all the August participants in this virtual conference for taking time out of their busy schedule and participate in this important topic of discussion. All the activities and attainments of the Bombay Chamber obviously can't be accomplished without the strong and consistent support of the Chamber Secretariat. I would therefore sort of like to take time out to have a special word of thanks for Dr. Sugita Upadhyay, DD of the Bombay Chamber, Aparna Singh, Executive Research, Mahadev Margi and Vikram Begi, who had been very effective handling the conference from the IT side of the picture for Bombay Chambers, and for their consistent commitment and zealous non-stop support to all our endeavors. Before closing, my humble request to all participants to please fill up the feedback form to enable us in conducting such events better in the future. Obviously, everybody understands the challenges of the time and the virtual nature of these conferences, and therefore these feedback would go a long way in refining our own sort of offerings to our members on this platform. Thank you very much from my side. And I hand it over to Dr. Khosla to make the closing comments.
Yeah. Mr. Khosla, you there? Okay, thank you so much once again, Mr. Nandakumar. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Indranil.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. Thank you, Mr. Nandakumar. Thank you, Indranil. Thank you to all participants.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Sugita, Aparna, and Mahadev. Mahadev, we also want some poha.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you,
Thank you.
participants. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Secretariat. Thanks.